Something changed in the Linux gaming landscape, whose change, the gaming press, whose coverage of platform gaming capability has historically been the coverage that measures Linux gaming against the Windows gaming standard, and finds the gap, whose documentation justifies the continued recommendation of Windows as the gaming platform whose superiority the gap's existence establishes, has not covered with the prominence that the change's magnitude warrants for the population of gamers whose platform choice the coverage informs. A change that did not arrive as the single dramatic announcement whose novelty makes the technology, news cycles coverage of it, the reflexive response to the announcement's presence rather than the considered assessment of the announcement's implications for the gaming experience that the coverage's production serves the reader by providing, but as the accumulated consequence of the specific technical developments whose individual arrivals the gaming and Linux communities documented in the specific channels, whose audience is the engaged community rather than the general gaming population, whose platform decisions the coverage serves, developments whose combination has produced the Linux gaming state, whose characterization as the massive upgrade this examination is providing, in the specific terms that the gaming performance measurements, the compatibility database statistics, and the daily gaming experience documentation, whose examination constitutes the evidence for the characterization rather than the enthusiasm, whose expression would require less evidence and communicate less useful information to the gamer whose platform decision this examination is informing. Linux gaming got a massive upgrade, and the upgrade's character is the character of the threshold crossing, whose significance is the significance not of the incremental improvement that each development in isolation represented, but of the combined crossing of the specific performance, compatibility, and usability thresholds, whose simultaneous crossing produces the qualitative change in the gaming experience's character that distinguishes the gaming platform whose use requires the acceptance of significant compromises from the gaming platform whose use requires the acceptance of minor inconveniences. The prior Linux gaming state was the state of significant compromises whose acceptance the Linux gamer's commitment to the platform required as the cost of the platform choice. The current Linux gaming state is the state of minor inconveniences whose navigation the Linux gamer's platform choice requires as the remaining friction that the upgrade has not yet eliminated. The distance between significant compromises and minor inconveniences is the distance that the massive upgrade characterization describes. The upgrade has 4 specific technical components, whose combined contribution to the threshold crossing this examination is documenting. Understanding each component's specific contribution before assembling the combined picture, whose comprehensiveness reveals the upgrade's full magnitude, is the analytical approach that produces the clearest understanding of why the Linux gaming state has changed as dramatically as the characterization claims. The first component is the Proton compatibility layer, whose development Valve has been funding, and whose progress across the version sequence from Proton's initial integration into Steam in 2018 through the current Proton 9 release represents the most consequential single investment in Linux gaming capability that any commercial entity has made in the platform's history. Proton is the compatibility layer whose implementation allows Windows games to run on Linux without the game developer's involvement in the Linux port, whose creation prior Linux gaming required as the precondition for the game's Linux availability, and whose implementation quality has been the primary determinant of the Linux gaming experience's quality since Proton's introduction. Because the compatibility layer, whose quality is the quality of the translation between the Windows game's expectations about the system it is running on and the Linux system's actual capabilities, determines whether the game runs, how well it runs, and what the gaming experience's character is relative to the native Windows experience, whose standard the comparison measures. The Proton 9 releases specific improvements over the prior versions, whose accumulated quality the current state reflects, include the Vulkan translation layer improvements, whose implementation in DXVK and VKD3D Proton, which are the specific components that translate the DirectX graphics, calls that Windows games use into the Vulkan graphics API that Linux supports natively, has reached the translation quality whose performance overhead has been reduced to the margin, whose measurement in the frame rate comparison between the Windows native execution and the Proton Linux execution produces differences whose magnitude falls within the measurement noise rather than the significant performance gap, whose documentation in the prior Proton versions comparisons established the performance cost of the compatibility layer as the primary practical limitation of the Linux gaming experience for the performance-sensitive gamer, whose frame rate requirements the prior Proton version's overhead was failing to meet. The ProtonDB community database, whose documentation of the gaming experience for individual games on Linux through the community reports that the gamers whose Linux gaming experience they are documenting contribute, has crossed the statistical threshold, whose significance for the gaming platform assessment transforms the database's characterization of the Linux gaming compatibility state from the characterization of the niche gaming platform whose compatibility coverage addresses the specific games that the Linux gaming community's members happen to play, to the characterization of the mainstream gaming platform whose compatibility coverage reflects the mainstream game library, whose coverage the mainstream gamer's platform assessment requires. The ProtonDB database's current documentation of over 20,000 games whose Linux compatibility status, the community reports, reveals that the games rated gold or platinum, which are the ratings indicating that the game runs perfectly or with minor issues on Linux through Proton, represent the substantial majority of the documented titles whose combined coverage of the mainstream game library establishes the Linux gaming compatibility state, as the state whose mainstream game library coverage is sufficient for the mainstream gamers library, rather than only the Linux gaming community's specific library. The second component of the massive upgrade is the Steam Deck's influence on the Linux gaming ecosystem, whose impact extends far beyond the handheld gaming device whose hardware the Steam Deck is to the software infrastructure, the game developer engagement, and the compatibility testing, whose scope the Steam Deck's commercial success has motivated Valve to invest in at the scale that the commercial success justifies as the return on the investment. The Steam Deck runs Steam OS, which is the Linux-based operating system whose gaming-focused implementation the Steam Deck's hardware platform required, and whose development has produced the software infrastructure improvements, whose availability on the desktop Linux gaming platform the Steam Deck's development as a Linux gaming platform has enabled as the consequence of the infrastructure investment's application to the general Linux gaming platform, rather than only the Steam Deck's specific hardware. The game developer engagement whose production the Steam Deck's commercial success has motivated is the engagement whose practical consequence for the Linux gaming compatibility state is the game developer's verification of their game's Steam Deck compatibility, which is the Linux compatibility verification whose conduct the Steam Deck rating system requires developers to perform, and whose performance produces the compatibility improvements that the verification process identifies as the fixes whose implementation the developer applies to achieve the Steam Deck rating, whose commercial value the rating's influence on the Steam Deck gamer's purchase decision creates as the commercial motivation for the developer's compatibility investment. The compatibility improvements, whose implementation the Steam Deck rating process motivates, are improvements that benefit the desktop Linux gamer, whose gaming experience the same compatibility improvements enhance because the desktop Linux gaming and the Steam Deck gaming share the Proton compatibility layer, whose quality the compatibility improvements advance. The third component of the massive upgrade is the gaming GPU driver improvement, whose progression on Linux has been the progression from the performance gap, whose documentation in the GPU benchmark comparisons between Linux and Windows established the driver quality difference as the technical explanation for the gaming performance difference to the performance parity, whose achievement in the current driver state the same benchmark comparisons. Document as the finding that replaces the performance gap finding for the majority of the gaming workloads whose measurement produces the parity result, rather than the gap result that the prior driver state's quality would have produced for the same measurement. The AMD GPU driver improvement is the improvement whose magnitude in the specific transition from the prior proprietary driver whose Linux support AMD provided to the open source AMD GPU driver whose development the AMD engineering team's open source contribution has been advancing, represents the most dramatic single driver quality improvement in the Linux gaming history because the transition from the proprietary driver, whose Linux gaming performance was the performance, whose gap from the Windows equivalent, the gaming, benchmarks consistently documented to the open source driver whose Linux gaming performance, the same benchmarks document as the performance, whose gap from the Windows equivalent has been reduced to the margin, whose practical significance for the gaming experience falls below the perceptibility threshold for the gaming. Workloads whose frame rates the margin's absolute value fails to affect in the terms that the gaming experience, rather than the benchmark measurement, reveals. The NVIDIA driver improvement, whose progression the NVIDIA open source kernel module's development represents, is the improvement whose significance for the Linux gaming ecosystem reflects NVIDIA's dominant position in the discrete gaming GPU market whose users' Linux gaming experience, the NVIDIA driver quality determines for the majority of the gaming PC hardware configurations, whose GPU is the NVIDIA GPU, whose market share the discrete gaming GPU market statistics document as the majority share. The open source kernel module's performance improvement over the prior. Closed source driver architecture has reduced the driver-related gaming performance issues whose documentation in the Linux gaming community's reports was the consistent finding that established the NVIDIA driver as the primary technical barrier to the Linux gaming experience's quality for the NVIDIA GPU user whose gaming PC's hardware made the NVIDIA driver quality the determining factor in the Linux gaming experience's character. The fourth component of the massive upgrade is the gaming-specific Linux distribution and desktop environment improvements, whose implementation has addressed the usability dimension of the Linux gaming experience, whose prior state required the technical knowledge whose possession the mainstream gamer whose Windows gaming experience had not required the development of, did not possess, as the precondition for the Linux gaming setup, whose correct configuration the gaming experience's quality required. The gaming-specific improvements include the automatic game optimization, whose implementation in the Feral Game Mode utility and the GameScope compositor, whose combined operation adjusts the system's performance profile during gaming sessions. To prioritize the gaming workload's resource requirements over the background process. Resource. Consumption, whose competition with the gaming workload the optimization reduces. The HDR gaming support, whose implementation in the Linux display infrastructure has addressed the high dynamic range display capability, whose prior Linux absence was the feature gap that the gaming experience on the high dynamic range display whose purchase the display quality conscious gamer had made was revealing as the missing capability whose absence the Windows gaming alternative provided without the Linux gaming's absence, requiring the acceptance of the HDR display's capability being unused during Linux gaming sessions. The gaming performance measurement, whose conduct across a representative sample of the mainstream gaming library produces the quantitative evidence for the massive upgrade characterization that the qualitative assessment's communication requires the quantitative grounding to establish as the evidence-based assessment rather than the impressionistic characterization. The frame rate comparison between the Linux Proton gaming and the Windows native gaming across the representative game titles, whose selection reflects the mainstream game library's composition rather than the cherry-picked titles whose favorable Linux performance the selective comparison would produce, reveals the performance relationship, whose character the upgrade's massive characterization requires the measurement to establish. The measurement results, whose documentation the gaming benchmarking community has been producing through the systematic comparison of Linux Proton. Performance and Windows native performance across the major game titles reveal the specific finding that the games whose Linux Proton performance equals or exceeds the Windows native performance represent the majority of the measured titles, with the games whose Linux Proton performance falls below the Windows native performance representing the minority whose performance differences magnitude in the cases where the difference exists falls within the range that the gaming experience rather than the benchmark measurement distinguishes as the perceptible performance difference whose practical gaming impact the measurement documents as the minor inconvenience rather than the significant compromise whose prior documentation established the Linux gaming performance gap as the primary practical barrier to the Linux gaming platform's mainstream adoption. The remaining limitations, whose honest acknowledgement this examination's credibility requires, alongside the upgrade's documentation, include the anti-cheat system incompatibility, whose persistence as the technical barrier to the Linux gaming of the specific multiplayer games whose anti-cheat implementation uses the kernel-level anti-bias cheat systems that the Linux gaming infrastructure cannot support without the kernel module access, whose security implications the Linux gaming community's values have consistently identified as the security compromise, whose acceptance the anti-cheat compatibility would require, at the cost that the gaming compatibility benefit does not justify. The games whose anti-cheat implementation uses the kernel-level systems include the specific competitive multiplayer titles, whose player populations include the Linux gamer, whose gaming library the anti-cheat incompatibility affects as the genuine limitation, whose scope the honest assessment of the Linux gaming state requires, acknowledging alongside the upgrade's documentation. The Wayland gaming compatibility, whose completion across the gaming GPU driver and the gaming application ecosystem has been progressing, but has not yet reached the completeness, whose achievement would make the Wayland display server the gaming display server whose adoption without the compatibility concerns the X11 display server's continued use for gaming avoids. The Wayland gaming compatibility's incomplete state is the limitation whose practical significance for the gaming experience depends on the specific gaming workload and the specific hardware configuration, whose combination determines whether the Wayland compatibility limitation is the limitation the gamer encounters or the limitation whose existence the gamer's specific configuration avoids through the X11 continued use that the Wayland compatibility completion's pending status makes the practical gaming configuration for the gaming workload whose Wayland compatibility the current state has not yet achieved. The gaming experience assessment, whose conduct across the 30 days of Linux gaming that this examination's experiential foundation provides, reveals the daily gaming experience whose character the upgrade has produced is the character of the experience that the threshold crossing from significant compromises to minor inconveniences describes in the terms that make the distinction comprehensible to the Windows gamer whose comparison standard the Windows gaming experience represents. The games that work well. The frame rates that the measurement documents as comparable to the Windows equivalent are the frame rates that the gaming session's experience confirms as the frame rates whose difference from the Windows equivalent falls below the perceptibility threshold, whose crossing the gaming experience rather than the benchmark measurement requires. The setup process whose prior Linux gaming state required the technical knowledge whose possession the mainstream gamer's Windows gaming background had not developed has been replaced by the Steam Play toggle whose enabling produces the Proton compatibility layer's application to the Steam game library without the configuration knowledge whose requirement the prior Linux gaming setup imposed. Linux gaming got a massive upgrade. The Proton compatibility layer's performance has reached the parity whose achievement the gaming benchmarks measurement confirms. The Steam Deck's commercial success has motivated the developer engagement whose consequence is the compatibility improvement that the desktop Linux gamer benefits from alongside the Steam Deck gamer. The GPU drivers have reached the quality whose performance on the gaming workload, the benchmark comparison with the Windows native performance, no longer documents as the significant gap. The gaming setup's usability has reached the accessibility whose achievement the mainstream gamer's technical knowledge level makes sufficient for the Linux gaming configuration without the specialized knowledge the prior Linux gaming setup required. The limitations remain. The anti-cheat incompatibility for the specific competitive multiplayer titles is the limitation whose persistence the upgrade has not eliminated, and whose elimination the technical architecture requires the anti-cheat developer's engagement to produce, rather than the Linux gaming infrastructure's unilateral solution. The Wayland gaming compatibility, whose completion is in progress, is the limitation whose resolution the development trajectory suggests is approaching, rather than receding. But the massive upgrade, whose documentation this examination has provided, is the upgrade that has transformed the Linux gaming experience from the experience of the platform enthusiast, whose commitment to the platform justifies the significant compromises the gaming requires, to the experience of the mainstream gamer, whose platform choice the gaming experience's quality now supports without the significant compromises, whose acceptance the enthusiast's commitment enabled, but the mainstream gamer's practical assessment precluded. The upgrade is real. The measurements confirm it. The ProtonDB database documents it. The daily gaming experience validates it. Linux gaming got a massive upgrade. The gaming that was possible on Linux before the upgrade was the gaming of the committed enthusiast. The gaming that is possible on Linux after the upgrade is the gaming of the mainstream gamer whose Windows gaming experience. The Linux alternative is now matching closely enough to make the platform choice the choice whose primary determinant is the platform's non-gaming properties, rather than the gaming performance whose gap from the Windows standard was the gaming barrier, whose crossing the upgrade has achieved. The barrier has been crossed. The gaming is here. And the upgrade that produced it was massive enough to deserve exactly that description.